Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome and good morning to all of you. It is my pleasure to open today's ICIS public forum on China's way, BRI, AIIB, NDB, SCS, LMC, and etc. It is a cliche this day to talk about global power shift, but that is exactly what is happening in intellectual affairs today. Amidst this ongoing global power shift, China now looms large on global stage. Its Belt and Road Initiative, ASEAN Infrastructure Investment Bank, and New Development Bank have the potential and redraw the global economic landscape. China's role in Southeast Asia from the South China Sea to Mekong region, the latter within the framework of China supported Lan-Chang Mekong cooperation, also may reshape regional dynamics. While China's bilateral relationships with most Southeast Asian countries have been strengthened. At the same time, ASEAN's roles, unity, and centrality have become more problematic. As the smaller regional states grapple with ongoing changes on the ground and in the sea, other major powers besides China are on the move in their own different ways. Southeast Asia is a region clearly in flux, a consequential nexus and area for contest and cooperation. What happens in Southeast Asia will be potential for what will happen on the broader global canvas. This public forum brings together top experts on the subject of China's rise, dynamism, and strategic aims and intention. We will start with Mr. Jim Stent's presentation based on his new book, China Banking Transformation, The Untold Story. As you see the pamphlet distributed to all of you. As a way of launching into more encompassing discussion on China, Southeast Asia, and broader geoeconomics and geopolitics. And when we cannot talk about China and ASEAN without talking about the United States, and when we talk about these regional actors, we would have to bring Japan, India, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, and the EU into the mix. So you are in for a treat this morning. China is undoubtedly making headway in many kinds of ways. Our discussion will shed some light on China's way. Please let me thank all of the speakers for sparing their time and for sharing their expertise with us. Again, Mr. Jim Stent, of course, is author of the excellent book on China's banking, which is highly recommended. We also have Thailand foremost expert on China in Professor Chulacheeb Chinwanno, and top regional affair expert Kavi Chongkittavorn. I particularly want to thank to Dr. Tang Qifang for making the trip from Beijing for this occasion, and we are grateful to the Chinese Embassy in Bangkok for supporting Dr. Tang's traveling to be with us today. And let me now hand the floor to Ajahn Thitinan, and thank you very much.
So let me begin also this way. Look, we have the next hour and 45 minutes, and we want to maximize value. We'll begin with Jim's presentation, Mr. Stent's presentation, based on the book that he's written. It's an excellent book. I've read parts of it already, haven't finished yet, but we'll soon. Look, today, Jim, I would say, for the next 20 minutes, each speaker will have. We have some students in the room. Normally, we would have this seminar from 9:30 to 11:30, and we will still revert to that next time. But today is an exception, 10 to 12, because it coincides with the class that I have. So there's some students here. Make sure to get the essay questions and sign your name to the registration to get credit. So Jim, let me begin this way. The students are being assigned today the first essay. And the question is, do Confucian values underpin China's economic success? This is one of the points of, one of the main arguments of the book. And this is a book, a very kind of stimulating, unusual kind of book. It argues that China is different. China's growth trajectory and geopolitical, geo-economic weight is something to be reckoned with in a different way. It also harks back to me as a scene setting, Jim. This is a deja vu, a little bit. 25 years ago, there was a big debate about Asian values. Whether values, deference to authority, education, filial piety, and so on, whether these Asian values actually underpin and propelled Asian economic success. And it led eventually to the East Asian Miracle study by the World Bank. But then it was kind of subdued or undermined, subverted by this economic crisis we had in 1997. Back in those days, the argument is this: these Asian countries knew something more than the market, that they can. There was a book in 1990 by Robert Wade. It was called Governing the Market. And there was a book about South Korea being a different kind of growth, Asia's Next Giant by Alice Rifton. And then Chalmers Johnson wrote about Japan, how Japan, the Japanese growth model is different, developmental state model, different than the West, than the Anglo-American model. So a lot of this debate now is coming back around China. That China's growth model is different. It is a kind of a developmental state model, state-led, not market-driven, not market-led. And I think Jim's book is a microcosm of this new debate. So Jim, over to you for the next 20 minutes. Please share with us your insights.
No.
Start over again. Can you hear me now? Good. Okay. Good morning. Thank you for the kind introduction. I served 13 years as an independent director of 2 Chinese banks from 2003 to 2016 in Beijing. And during that time, I was witness to and a minor participant in an extraordinary transformation of Chinese banking. At the same time, I was reading a steady, increasing drumbeat of negative viewpoint on Chinese banks and on the Chinese economic growth from Western sources. And it was 2 different worlds that were being described. One was in the West, the Chinese banks were fragile, that they were prone to collapse, and that they'd bring the whole economy down with them. Well, it was so diametrically different from what I was seeing, in fact, occurring, that I finally decided to write a book about it. Well, as I worked on the book, I realized that simply describing the transformation would be inadequate for Western readers to understand what I was talking about. Why? Because Chinese banking is deeply embedded in the Chinese political economy. So I started writing about that as well. And then I realized you can't understand Chinese banking or Chinese political economy if you don't talk a bit about the cultural milieu in which both the banking and the political economy are embedded. So my book, in a sense, is not just a discussion of Chinese banking and how it, contrary to the Western narrative, how it's working quite well within the Chinese context, but it's also, as Ajahn Thitinan just said, a microcosm or put another way, it's a case study of how China works today and how the way it works today arises out of literally thousands of years of cultural background. I would just like to comment one remark on your question about Asian values, Ajahn, because one of the things I specifically state in the book is that I am describing how China works, but I am not stating that the way China works is a model for other countries, and by and large, China doesn't think it's a model for other countries either, unlike the United States, which thinks its way is a good model. China says, this is the way it works in China. It's good for us. How you do it is up to you. And I think it's a very important thing to understand. I do not attribute China's economic growth to their particular cultural values. I simply say the cultural values have conditioned the way China develops. Could they have done better using another way? Possibly, but it wouldn't happen because it's China. All right. I am, for our discussion this morning, going to take 4 themes that run through my book, which explain how China's banking works, and which I think equally well explain most other parts of China as well, and the geostrategic issues that we have been asked to talk about this morning. The 4 themes are: first, wealth and power; second is strategic focus; third is pragmatism; and fourth is the power of the party state. Let me take each of them briefly and then discuss how they relate to some of the acronyms that we've put in the title of our discussion this morning. Wealth and power. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that almost everything China does today ultimately is with the objective of what they call rejuvenating China, or supporting China's rise, or better put, re-emergence, because it was a great power at one time. It's not rising for the first time, it's rising for, well, many times it's happened. This is a re-emergence. The objective of wealth and power is for the nation and the people. They're inseparable in the Chinese thinking. The Chinese use the term min fu wo chang, that the people must be wealthy if the nation is going to be strong, and if the nation is strong, the people will be wealthy. So everything proceeds from that ultimate goal. That's where China is headed for and has been headed for a long time. In fact, most of the last 150 years of Chinese history has been an attempt to find the recipe for achieving wealth, or recovering wealth and power. And with the opening reform that Deng Xiaoping launched, they feel that they're on the right road. Second point, strategic focus. Chinese are really good at strategy. They have a vision, they have that overall objective, and they have visions of what China will be like in the future. It's packaged in different ways by different leaders. Under the previous head of China, Hu Jintao, it was called Harmonious Society. And now under Xi Jinping, it's called the China Dream. But that's where they intend to get. They then have a very vigorous debate in China about policy, both publicly and privately. And bit by bit, consensus emerges on what are the strategies they need to put in place in order to realize the China Dream, in order to make the country indeed become wealthy and powerful. Once they have the strategy in place, they implement steadily, but often very slowly. For example, in 1993, at the third plenum of that year of the Communist Party, they laid out the objective of reform of the banking system. They didn't actually start working on it, though, until about 1998, and it didn't fully get underway until 2000, and then finally they could say they pretty much had accomplished the reform of the banking system by 2010. So once the objective is put out there, chances are very good they will do it, but perhaps slower than many of us would hope for. This results, very often you'll read in the press, criticism of China. Well, they announced they're going to do something and then nothing happened. Well, they're experimenting. They're doing pilot projects. They're feeling their way. Xi Jinping's speech at the 19th Party Congress, quinquennial event that was held in October of last year. He spoke for 3.5 hours. And in English translation, it runs to 64 pages. I encourage you to read it, because he basically said, for the last 30 years, we have been trying to build a moderately prosperous society, a Xiaokang Shouhui. And now we've pretty much achieved that. For the next 30 years, we're going to move into the next stage of growth. And he then laid out for well over 2 hours all the aspects of that. And that includes a change from China's foreign policy of the previous 30 years, when China had adhered to Deng Xiaoping's injunction, don't get involved overseas, focus domestically. But China, now that it is a moderately prosperous country, feels it's in a position to begin to assert itself on the international stage. So they're moving into a new phase in Chinese international relations. The domestic strategy that he laid out is heavily based upon the formula that they think works very well. Westerners often scoff at it, but the Chinese feel that you can combine a market economy with a socialist economy. So they call it market socialism, as opposed to the Anglo-American model of market capitalism. They believe, they understand the power of competition, but at the same time, they feel that the state can play a very valuable role in guiding and intervening in the economy to affect economic outcomes. They don't believe that the market, as in America, solves all problems. They look at what happened in 2008 and they said, not for us. Okay, internationally, I divide the strategy that we can see developing in China into three portions. First, they're building up their military strength. And this has been a major preoccupation of Xi Jinping in his first 5-year term. And Xi Jinping specifically said in his October address, by mid-21st century, that's 2050, our people's armed forces have been fully transformed into world-class forces, meaning we will then be a world power. Secondly, China is trying to push back the United States from its peripheries. And in this, it shares this objective with its partner, Russia, which is also engaged in the same thing. If you look at the world environment from the point of view of a strategist in Beijing, it looks kind of threatening, because all around the Chinese littoral and way on into the Indian Ocean, you have a string of US allies and bases, Japan, Korea, Philippines. Then you have the American Navy calling in Hong Kong, which belongs to China. You have it calling in to Vietnam, a fellow communist country. You have it calling in at Sataheep and in Singapore now. And if you go then into towards the Indian Ocean, the US fleet controls the Straits of Malacca, through which most of China's imported energy flows. Diego Garcia, a big US base in the Indian Ocean, and of course several bases in the Gulf, Bahrain and Qatar. So that's not a very friendly environment that you're looking at if you're a Chinese strategist. So the objective then is to secure your periphery, to begin to push outwards over the next decades, not next year, bit by bit, slowly. But the key part of the international strategy, and the key way in which they intend to accomplish this, I think, is economic, financial, and commercial. And that leads into the various acronyms that we're going to discuss this morning. They have decided that the creation of a comprehensive network of trade and economic and financial relationships all over the Eurasian mass will be their best way of securing dominance in Asia and asserting their role, and coincidentally pushing the US back. So that's strategic focus. Third is pragmatism, non-ideological. Don't care whether the cat is a black cat or a white cat, just so long as it catches the mice. That's the slogan that they've used. They are very averse to taking risk. We see that very much in the banking circle, very, very conservative. If you look here in Thailand, two Chinese banks here, the Bank of China and the Industrial Commercial Bank of China, both been here for many years, but rather low profile. They support Chinese companies coming down here. They don't push out aggressively into the market, step by step moving along. In the phrase attributed to Deng Xiaoping, cross the river by feeling the stones. They're afraid of falling into the water. That's why they do things rather slowly. Once they've outlined an objective and a strategy, implement at a rate that they can manage. And very important, constantly adapt to changing circumstances. A speaker who spoke here last year, David Shambaugh, has written a wonderful book about how China has remained a country under Communist Party because of the Communist Party's ability to adapt. Fourth and last theme is the power of the party state. This is something foreigners often underestimate. They say, oh, the Chinese government can't do that. Well, actually, the Chinese government can, and it does do it when it thinks it's a priority. When I give presentations in Singapore, I say to the audience, I think the power of the party state is something you understand in Singapore, and they chuckle and say, yeah, we understand that. But the US, we don't understand it. Don't underestimate it. It's a market socialist economy, and the government intervenes whenever it feels it can affect the outcome for the better, or it can ward off problems. It has the advantage of great continuity. How many countries in the world can in fact make 30-year plans and then actually stick to them? Because the people who are going to be the leaders 20 years from now in China have been involved in the planning process now. So those are my four themes. Now, how do they relate to Thailand, ASEAN, and our relations with China? Well, I think of the acronyms that Ajahn Thitinan has put up there in the title, I think the most important one is One Belt, One Road, or Belt Road Initiative, BRI, or OBOR. This is the linchpin of the strategy of China to reassert itself on the world stage through expanding out in Eurasia, down into Southeast Asia, west into Central Asia, and on eventually, presumably, into Eastern Europe and down into areas like Iran. So this strategy is a very long-term strategy. I think it's a very bold vision. It must be understood as being composed of many, many parts. The Chinese, when they do their strategy, it's a holistic strategy. All the different parts fit together, and then they are prioritized, and they're modulated like a conductor conducting an orchestra, which areas get the emphasis. It happens also, the timing is, I think, partially it's come about because the United States announced its shift to Asia under the Obama administration, and the two parts of the One Belt, One Road program, one is the maritime road through Southeast Asia, and the other is the land-based road through Central Asia. And the maritime road directly reacts to the American shift to Asia. The land road then, while America is very much preoccupied with problems in the Middle East and is shifting into Southeast Asia, China is beginning to push west into Central Asia and developing very close relations with those countries, as I said earlier, partnering in many things with Russia, and very wisely staying completely free of any entanglements in the Middle East. Underneath this, we have the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB. This might or might not have come about if the United States and Europe had permitted China to have voting rights within the World Bank and the IMF, commensurate with the size of China's economy. However, we didn't, and therefore the Chinese decided, in that case, if we can't be part of these institutions, we'll set up our own development bank. I think China is very serious about it. I often get asked, is it going to work? And I think the Chinese see that not only is this an integral part of their strategies for One Belt, One Road, but very much very important to China's future credibility and prestige in the world. It's made up of many members. Over 50 countries have joined it, but it is sponsored by China. It's headquartered in China, and China's prestige internationally is very much attached to it. They put an outstanding person in as the CEO, and in true Chinese style, they're proceeding very slowly. People say, well, they're not lending out very much money yet. No, they're feeling their way they're crossing the river by feeling the stones, bit by bit. But I think they're looking at it as something that will be very important for China asserting itself in the world over 20 years. New Development Bank is the BRICS Bank. Brazil, South Africa, Russia, China, India. All countries share in this, but the headquarters is in Shanghai, even though an Indian is the CEO. It is interesting. It proclaims on its website that they are building sustainable future. It's focusing on lending into new technologies, environmental technologies, and also infrastructure. I think it's also interesting and worthy of taking notice because through this, its other initiatives are basically limited to Eurasia, but through this, it is involved with Africa. One of its members is South Africa, and one of its members is Brazil, which puts it in South America as well. So they are not totally neglecting the non-Eurasian areas of the world. The Mekong Lancang River Initiative. I have a house on the Mekong River in Chiang Rai where I spent the last few days, and it used to be I looked across the river and I saw Lao farmers. Now I look across the river and I see Chinese banana plantation growers. China has become very sensitive to Thailand's concern about blasting the rapids on the Mekong River to permit Chinese shipping to go down. Seems they're backing off from that. That's the way it looks now. I had dinner 2 nights ago in Chiang Rai with one of the Chiang Rai business leaders, and he's on his way to Beijing in a few days to participate in a seminar among the Mekong nations to talk about how to get business really flowing between them. So that is something that it's much smaller in scale than things like AIIB, but it's very relevant to Thailand. I mentioned the military aspect of China's developing international relations, but all these things I've mentioned so far have been in the economic, financial, and trade area, and I could adduce many other ones in addition. I think that military, as I see it, is limited to, first of all, making sure that China is not vulnerable to being pushed around by anybody else, and second of all, to asserting itself in regions which it regards as core interests. Basically, they feel, based on history, are part of China. And that would be the Diaoyutai Islands, South China Sea, and the Sino-Indian border areas. These are disputed areas. You can view their Chinese claims to them either positively or negatively, but the point is China says, we are going to demand these. So that's where military gets involved. All the other things I've mentioned, the US has a string of bases around China. China is starting some bases, very tentatively, one in Djibouti. But basically the Chinese international strategy is more economically and commercially based. Let me wrap up by just 2 final comments. Here in Thailand, and in ASEAN, we are in a contested zone, contested between the United States and China. And a lot of thought is being given to this issue. And there are those, both in China and in America, who maintain that this rivalry, this contest for influence, is a zero-sum game. One guy wins, one guy loses. Personally, I don't think that need be. It could become the case, in which case it's gloomy prospect for the world, the so-called Thucydides trap, but I think smart diplomacy could avoid that outcome. I think that containing China is clearly futile. It was sort of symbolized, I think, by the decision of the Obama administration to ask all of our allies to not join AIIB. Well, they all joined, and we look kind of silly and we're not part of it, and all of our allies are part of it. So, trying to stop China is, I think, a futile game. I think the US and China need to figure out ways in which they can work together in Asia in a win-win kind of a situation. very good Australian geostrategist, Hugh White, has written a book on this, where he says this is the way that the US has to redefine its strategy for Asia. China's strategy is very, very clear. Just read Xi Jinping's speech, read other things that are published by the Chinese, read them very carefully because they mean what they say. It's all out there in black and white. The US, I think, for the last 15 years has been struggling to define its objectives and strategy for the Eurasian area. And I think the US really has to come to grips with that. In the Cold War, we had a very clear strategy. You could pick off 8 or 10 components to it, all had a very clear strategy. I think we don't have a strategy like that. And we need to have a strategy that causes the US to engage, to compete and engage with China at the same time. Competition is healthy, conflict is not. So lastly, Thailand. How does Thailand and how more broadly does ASEAN fit into this very new world that we're facing that's emerged over the last decade and arguably over just the last few years? Well, Southeast Asia, as I see it, basically wants a stable environment in which to develop, to grow, and to prosper. And so it has a stake in the US-China contest being a win-win situation. Thailand traditionally has, for the most part, been very, very good at navigating troubled waters internationally. I hope it continues to do that. Every indication is that they will. I think Thailand's positioning itself quite well vis-a-vis the US and China. The question for Thailand, really, I think, is how do we maximize benefits to Thailand from a win-win situation between China and the US? How can we be friends with both sides, take sides, don't take sides in disputes, and result in Thailand, a middle-sized country, actually perhaps having a bit of influence on the two giants that it has to deal with? Thailand in the past has been normally reactive in its foreign policy. But maybe it's in a position being courted by both of these two powers to be more assertive in the past. To do that, though, Thailand needs to understand China very, very well. China understands the West. Thailand understands the West very, very well. Thailand's had 100 years of relations with the West, understand the values, travel there frequently, many people educated there, English is widely spoken. However, Thailand does not understand China very well, despite all the descendants of Chinese immigrants who were here. So I hope that this becomes a major focus of the government and of the education system to understand China best. And I would suggest, Ajahn Thitinan, that ISIS can play a very constructive role in fostering this understanding. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. That was authoritative. You heard how he talked about Thailand as a we, right? So he's actually Thai. He doesn't look Thai, but he talks of Thailand as a we. But he also is part Chinese and looks American. So he's a hybrid American and Chinese and Thai. Jim, I have to ask a 1-minute follow-up. It's an important one. One of the points you noted was that the Chinese BRI, AIIB, a lot of these vehicles were reactions to the Obama pivot rebalance. That's something that has been going around as a kind of a thesis of view that in fact the Obama administration stirred up the plot in a way and didn't have the answer for it once China stepped up. Question is this, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. And there was in 1991, after decades, we had the Soviet Union, we had the Cold War, from 1917 through to 1991. So there was a big gut-wrenching exercise in Sovietology. People who studied the Soviet Union, they could not believe that they didn't see it coming. They didn't see it coming. So in 1991, there was a big issue of the national interest. It was a black cover, I remember vividly. And all these Soviet experts, they were asking themselves, hey, what happened? How come the Soviet Union collapsed and we didn't see it? Now, let me draw this comparison, Jim, and ask you a question. What are some of the fragilities? I mean, this book, your presentation, is a synopsis of a view that this is not just going to be an Asian century. It's going to be a Chinese century. China is reshaping the international life. But is there any weakness? You know, there has been a kind of a graveyard, a cemetery of China skeptics. I remember in 2002 there was a book called The Coming Collapse of China by Gordon Chang. And I hear all kinds of stories about China collapsing, myself included. I have some doubts about the Chinese model. You know, how can you have a capitalist economy with a very centralized control, a lot of repression? But it has not collapsed. It has claimed all these casualties among all the critics, the latest being David Shambaugh, you know, who's written a lot about China. But recently he became skeptical of the China success, and he thought that maybe it cannot be sustained. So, Jim, I mean, is it invincible? Can China collapse? What would be some of the fragilities or fracture points that we should be mindful of?
Excellent question. I think David Shambaugh had the answer correctly with his book that he wrote in 2009, which was that China, the key to China's ongoing success has been that studied very carefully what went wrong in Russia, what went wrong in Eastern Europe, and what is going right in the West. And it learned lessons from all of that, and it adapted. So his book is called China's Communist Party, Adaptation or Atrophy. And he said clearly that China adapted. Since then, he's changed his mind, and he's written articles and saying, no, now China's becoming like the Soviet Union, it's becoming rigid, it's no longer adapting, etc. But I must update you a little more. I emailed David not long ago and said, any thoughts on the latest party Congress? And he said, it's strengthened China a great deal. So I think David is seeing adaptation. Indeed, a very key sentence in Xi Jinping's speech is, he said, the world changes every minute. China changes every minute. We, the party, must change every minute. Constantly adapt to new situations, because if we don't, we will indeed go the way of the Soviet Union. And I think that is the answer to your question. If China can continue to have the political will to adapt, then economic and other problems can be resolved.
Let's move to Kavi Chongkittavorn, who is a veteran, 40 years. He's been working on Asian affairs. He also spent time in China, speaks Chinese and Pigui. So what is it? It's not quite China's world yet. It's China's way, certainly in Asia, and it's China Southeast Asia.
It is going to become China world, whether you are ready or not. But the point here is, as James has emphasis, you have to understand China and Chinese character. Chinese character, I mean Chinese Hanyi, the Chinese character that's spelled out in 4 square, because there are a lot of mistranslation. When China says something, you know, we interpret it differently. This is why Dr. Tang is here to explain when China says something. I think James has made very clear. In fact, he covered the whole thing, because you don't have healthy banking with some missing hole out there, you know. So I think China has done well. He mentioned Thai-China relation, which need a lot of work. That is actually my 3rd point. But I would like to turn this into my 1st point. I would discuss about Xi Jinping's new approach, because China no longer, what do you call, keep low profile. China has already awoken, and it will be assertive, and you have to understand. And my last point is reaction for the region, how region like ASEAN will respond to all these acronym soup, you know, which is all Chinese, very important, because these acronym represents the emerging Sinocentric or China-oriented, whatever you want to use, is a Sinocentric pathway. It's the kind of a work in progress and very fast. Now, James had raised a very important point, Thai relation with China. For me, Thai-China relation is very fragile and full of hole and very hollow. We need to do a lot of homework, very superficial, because Thai Chinese relation is like a pyramid. On the top, very good. It's a high level, high-end meetings. The princess visit China 40 times, the largest number of royal family that visit China in the world. And the lowest level, the people's exchange last year, 12 million Chinese tourists visit Thailand on the average days, over 30,000. That is excellent, but in the middle, nothing. You can ask Dr. Chulacheeb. Dr. Chulacheeb is the prominent sinologist. You ask him whether he can give 3 or 4 names beside him, who write a book about China history, philosophy using Chinese language. I think he will have great difficulty in name one. So Thai-China relations has a lot of work to do, and I think James is very worried because Thailand is very important to China's southward policy, whether it's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, whether Thailand is act as a conduit for ASEAN, whether whatever you do, Thailand will be the center of Chinese Asian policy, Chinese ASEAN policy. Oftentimes people say that Thai-Chinese relation go back 2,000 years. If you talk to some of the politicians, they will add 1,000 years. But that is nothing to do with understanding of Thailand. You go to Yawarat, you think that's Chinese. No, that is like a Potemkin village to me. Because it's outside, it's very Chinese, but inside, it's very Thai. You know, we have Chinese New Year's, but we don't have holiday. Philippines just announced to commemorate their relation with China. They're going to have national holidays on the Chinese Lunar New Year's. Thailand, you don't have national holidays. If the relation is really good, you know, at least you must have holidays. So, having said that, I just want to make the point, Thai-Chinese relation is very fragile, and it's not true. People always say that we tilt toward China. No, it is not. Thailand never pro-China, believe me. We also have never pro-America. We only pro-Thai, let it be clear. That is why Thailand, nobody trusts Thailand as far as. That is why we are so flexible. Having said that, I will move on to my second point. Xi Jinping foreign policy is great. And like Dr. James, he really mean it. You have to read Chinese and understand the Chinese. I will give you one example. The other day when Li Keqiang went to Cambodia and they discussed how the Lan Chang Mekong Corporation will proceed. By the way, Lan Chang Mekong proceed like a high-speed train. Just less than 900 days, they have accomplished more than MRC, you know, which is established for over 5 or 6 decades. So Xi Jinping foreign policy means business. And you have to read every word, the 64 page of his policy. And I think Thailand now is understand. For example, China from now on will be more, are you ready for this? Will be more assertive and will be able and have the capacity to intervene constructively with Chinese characters. I don't know what, but I can tell you, judging from the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, I think China has done so far a very good job in constructive interference or intervention, whatever word you want to use, try to get these two countries together. And then you have the second example in Maldives, but that's not as much as role as the Xi would like to see. But in the case of Rohingya issue, I think China role will be big and sustainable. Look at the way Xi Jinping approached the issue. He went to Bangladesh, he came to Naypyidaw, he held discussions with everyone and come out with 3 approach that they must have ceasefire, make sure that the local settles the hostility, and then followed by international assistance, and then tackle the root cause. This kind of thing is something new, and I think China now has the confidence to engage with the so-called hotspot. Of course, there are other hotspots in the region. You have South China Sea, which is really a hot one. But I think, in my view, James has not mentioned South China Sea. I think South China Sea movement is a bit towards the conclusion of conduct. I believe that COC will be concluded next year in Thailand, not in Singapore, even though Singapore is a coordinating country which will end in July. And I think Singapore will make sure that certain progress will be very firm so that it laid the groundwork for the COC to be complete next year. A lot of people ask me whether it's interest to China to complete COC. I said yes, even though they still have one big issue, that is whether the COC will be binding or not. But in the end, I think it will be binding, but the level of the discussion will determine how big and how far on the scope. Finally, I think one of the most important things that China has to deal with, because of all these new approach, China is good in planning for 30 years, 60 years, 1,000 years, know exactly what's moving on. In ASEAN, we also have our plan, but ASEAN cannot catch up with China. That's explained why China fails to respond to China. Several, almost hundreds new proposals. In fact, this is my own counting, is not official. There's over 100 projects that ASEAN has not yet responded to China initiative over this year. China and ASEAN has a very long relation, just commemorate 25 years, excellent. But from now on, China relations with ASEAN will be based on day-to-day, program-to-program evaluation. So ASEAN and China relations from now on will be much more difficult, and it has to based on solid foundations of output. I will explain why. Number one, since the BRI came into existence, China has proposed to ASEAN to set up a high-level steering committee to synergize BRI and ASEAN master plan of connectivity. So far, ASEAN has not yet responded. The reason is very simple, because ASEAN as a whole, I repeat, has not yet reached the trust level to endorse BRI. This is why you see countries like Thailand, Malaysia very actively, Indonesia support BRI individually, Cambodia, also Myanmar. But as long as you don't have ASEAN as a group endorse BRI, it will cause further high level of suspicion. So I think it's very important until China really reach that level. So what I'm saying, all these new Xi Jinping plans, the high profile, very assertive engagement with ASEAN, with Thailand, with all other countries, there's still an element of trust. There's still level of trust deficit. And I think this is important. Otherwise, it will be difficult. Now, when China says something, ASEAN normally takes time to understand. I have to go back to what I said. During the visits to Cambodia and the discussion on the Lanchang Mekong cooperation, there was a word that China used, T2G, means bulldozer. And China used the word to mean in a positive way. You need bulldozer to flatten the ground to make sure everything runs smoothly for Lanchang Mekong cooperation. That is why less than 900 days, China and CLMV T country, including Thailand, has cooperated and came out with so many projects. But the word bulldozer in the Western sense is very, very negative. It means that the big power impose all these regulations, policy. But that is not the case. I think it was lost in translation. So later on, I read the statement, it has been changed to high-speed operation. So this kind of thing happened. It's not only happened to China, it happened also to Japan, it's also happened to South Korea, because this country, when they write their policy, they write in their own language and translate into English. Only in Thailand, when we want to communicate with foreigners, we write in English and then translate into Thai. Have you ever noticed that? So, but in China, you cannot do that. So I think overall, that is how China needs to be careful. Now, my another last observation is that China now has changed its approach to Southeast Asia because it's close. And it's very important that China maintain high level of trust. Otherwise, it's very difficult because ASEAN comprise one of the most diverse country in the world. You have all kinds of political system. You have the biggest Muslim country. You have biggest country put together, Buddhist nations, and you have Philippines, Christians, one of the largest in the world. So you must create high level of trust. Now, China's strategy is very simple when they deal with ASEAN. China is very flexible because they treat ASEAN as a strategic partnership. This is not something new, but it's something that people don't understand because China has a high level of flexibility and very pragmatic. Secondly, China would like to weaken the current whatever alliance system that you have. That is why China has been proposing a lot of cooperation, like treaties of good neighborliness and friendship, which has not been accepted by ASEAN country except Cambodia. This is very important because China signaled that we are willing to cooperate with you, but are not willing to form an alliance. You can see that China now has given strong support with military aids to Myanmar, to Cambodia, to Laos, to Thailand, and have of late have increased military joint exercise with Indonesia, with Malaysia, with Thailand, with many other countries. These are also very important. Finally, I think this is point to my early statement that China now is willing to take a high profile and also willing to participate in whatever capacity they think that will help to increase peace and stability in the region. And it's still, after all, a work in progress. And I think ASEAN, Thailand need to follow China, understand China, as I said, in the Chinese way and Chinese character. Thank you.